Thank you so much, Barbara. Hello, Rose. I haven't seen you for 5 minutes.
I know.
It's been way too long.
And you gave me too much to eat, so I'm going to have to drink
Well, just
water.
a nibble. I just gave you a nibble. This is so. This is so great. Thank everybody for coming. This is wonderful, and what a treat and an honor to be able to ask you some questions about your wonderful book. So we'll just get right into it. Did you know when you started writing this book some years ago, how all-consuming it would be to work on it? We were talking about it earlier, and you said you really found it hard to read other people's books when you were working on it, or write poetry, that the books started kind of stacking up, waiting to be read, because you really had to focus on this and your own voice. And I just wanted you to talk a little bit about that.
Well, I never planned to look backwards and write a memoir, but I got an offer, and I was here pretty much by myself during 3 years of COVID. And so I thought, well, let's just think about it. I always looked forward, not past. But with a pen and a pad in front of me and nothing much else to do, I started thinking. And I had the best time remembering my early childhood, which I had never thought about before. And that was in Baltimore and in Atlantic City and then in Friends School. And it suddenly all came back to me, and it was sort of fun because I had a great childhood and good times and a lot of adventures. And so then I just went on scribbling, and I didn't think about it, and it wasn't in any autobiographical order. And then I suddenly remembered all the trips that I had taken for Amnesty and for Penn, different parts of the world. And I couldn't imagine that I would have remembered all that stuff and all the details, but if you're working abroad for human rights, you're not allowed to take notes about anything. You have to keep it all in your head and spill it out when you get back to the United States. And so whatever I spilled out, some of it was still there. And I really was delighted that I had pulled my life together in some way. And even though I wrote much, much too much, and my editor cut out lots and lots, so I'm hoping my good friends that I wrote about don't miss what I wrote about them. But it's long enough as it is.
Well, it's I wondered, because you've said yourself you really don't like looking back that much. You prefer to look forward, or even better, live in the present. We talked about that too. You really, really love to live in the moment. Was there any kind of, and just say no if there wasn't, theme that emerged when you kind of wrote about these bits and pieces of your life as they started to accrue? Did you think, gee, I was more like this than like that? Or any kind of thread through your life that came to you?
I hadn't really thought about that, but I think the thread is that I was always ready for the next adventure.
Yes.
And that I sort of was very much in the present, looking forward to the next thing, whatever it would be, not looking back,
Right.
as you said, and not even really imagining what the future would be, just being there and living it.
And not planning it. We talked about the fact that you didn't have a 5-year plan for yourself, or a 10-year plan, or
a 1-year plan.
Or a 1-year plan. This sense of adventure and of yourself as an adventurer runs so strongly through the whole book, and is in the title, of course, Adventurous Tales of the Heart. And from you mentioned your early childhood. It was so telling and so still so you. As a little girl, you would sneak out of your house through the bedroom window and kind of roam around the neighborhood. I know you don't do that anymore. Um, but
Well,
this rather intrepid quality has stayed with you your entire life. Nothing, most of us, if we're born that way, life sort of shakes it out of us at some point and we learn to be fearful.
well, I haven't climbed out of my bedroom window and shimmied down the sycamore tree and run around the neighborhood lately. But I still always turn up in time for breakfast.
Yes, you do. Yes, you do. And you still love to have adventures. You're fearless on small planes. You
Well,
know,
I
go-
piloted them and I loved it. Or I was a co-pilot after I trained both in Katama and in Connecticut. But after I got my soloing, Amnesty International began sending me all over the world, and I never had time to get enough hours to get a pilot's license. I can co-pilot, and I love being in the air.
Yes, you do. Yes, you do. Something that we talked about earlier, part of your childhood, a really important part of your childhood. You grew up in Baltimore, of course, but your time in summers in Atlantic City, you said to me, I became myself in Atlantic City. And I wondered if you would talk a little bit more about that.
Well, the year I was 6, my parents took my decade older sister and brother out west and sent me to Atlantic City to live with my wonderful little nearsighted grandmother for a few weeks. And every morning she would say, "Dear, would you lay out the mahjong tiles for me?" So I remember all these wonderful little ivory tiles I laid out. And then we'd have breakfast, and then she'd give me a purse, a little gold purse full of coins, and she'd say, "Go have a good time on the boardwalk, dear. Don't go near the water. Be back in time for lunch." So when I started writing this, I remembered my wonderful daily trips. I was in love with a 16-year-old elevator operator, Dick McCormick, and he would take me down and to where I was supposed to swim, and I wouldn't. I'd walk around and go back up to the boardwalk and go to Frailinger saltwater taffy, and then have the most wonderful few hours at the Steel Pier and the $1 Million Pier and doing everything except swimming. I became a swimmer after I got back to Baltimore in World War II when we were all stuck there.
But you loved watching. You said you loved scaring yourself by watching the creatures behind glass at the Steel
yes.
Pier. These were real ocean creatures.
They were ocean creatures who had been brought to this big glassed-in facility at the bottom of the $1 Million Pier. And I'd walk down there first, and they'd come up right to the glass and scare me. And then I'd go up to the top floor where there were these lovely 2 young women who clicked their heels on the horses that they were on and dived way down into the sea in Atlantic City. So I loved that, and that was sort of my first thing. And then I'd go play skee ball, or I'd go climbing. Unfortunately, I remembered everything I did every day when I started
But
writing.
it was a great liberation from being a rather very protected child
That's
in your
right.
household.
That's
The
right.
youngest child, and you were.
I was very protected. My parents weren't around. I mean, they were doing good work in Baltimore and Washington, and my older siblings were at college. So I was left at home with wonderful 2 women who saw that I didn't get into too much trouble although I did around the neighborhood by climbing out the window in the morning and running around the neighborhood. And this was brought back to me when I was in my 60s, and I was on Park Avenue in New York looking in a big glass window at China, and I heard behind me and saw reflected in the glass a very little 90 something year old man whom I recognized that I hadn't seen since I was 6 or 7, who had lived in our Windsor Hills neighborhood in Baltimore. And once, when I had climbed out of my window and was running around at about 6 a.m. on a Sunday summer morning like today, I saw him with a much taller woman. He was a neighbor, a rather famous international scientist whose children I knew, and he was escorting hand in hand my mother's best friend, who was a lot taller than he was and married to somebody else in the neighborhood. And having read all the Nancy Drew books by that time, because my father would bring them to me one at a time, and my older brother and sister had taught me to read, being Nancy Drew, I looked at them and said, "Gotcha." 60 years later, this man is pointing to my back with the taller woman that he was with, saying, "There's the naughty little Burgunder girl I told you about." So a lot of it came back to me, and that was fun.
The
and
naughty
funny.
little Burgunder girl. Oh my goodness. Oh my. And also, you read. Speaking of Nancy Drew, I had to look up a couple of these other adventure books that you were kind of addicted to. Besides Nancy Drew and the Hardy Boys, I knew who they were, but Beverly Gray, Girl Reporter. Does anybody remember Beverly Gray, Girl Reporter? There were something like 56 Beverly Gray books, and I'm sure you read them all.
Of course I read them all, and I wanted to go to the Orient with Beverly Gray. That was my
Who wouldn't?
top
Who
adventure.
wouldn't? And Susanna of the Yukon was another one.
Right. They're not around anymore. I'm sorry
No,
to
I'm
say.
sorry they aren't. But these were very formative for you too. You read,
Right.
These adventurous girls and boys were. You weren't much of a girl who played with dolls. It seemed to me.
No,
not
not
a real
much.
doll girl.
I mean, I had a Shirley Temple doll, which I was given for my 5th birthday, and I put her somewhere.
But you were much more into the adventures. Well, moving on, you went to college. You studied poetry at Johns Hopkins after Wellesley, and then, like most women of your generation, you got married and started having children. And in thinking about this, I thought to myself, did any part of you see this as a contradiction to being a girl adventurer, or as a continuation of your adventure as
What
a person?
Good question. Well, I left after getting my degree at Johns Hopkins and moved to Rome and met my husband, William Styron, and then we went to Paris and met Peter Matheson and George Plimpton and all the Paris Review crowd, and then we decided we might as well get married, which we did in Rome, and then we had a 9-month honeymoon in Ravello with all our friends, and then we came back and settled in rural Connecticut and began to have children, and I loved it. I loved every minute of it. That was my present adventure.
Right.
And I ended up with 4 wonderful kids, all of whom are here on the vineyard right now. And I sort of had my second childhood with them, playing outside, and I couldn't have been happier.
I did want to ask you, you playfully, you did say that when you got married, you weren't sure if it was going to last for a year, or that was kind of another adventure you were having. I mean, that you didn't really think ahead too much.
That's true. I didn't think ahead, and I couldn't imagine what being married was like. All my friends were married by then because I was 23, and they had all gotten married by the time they were 21. And I just wasn't looking beyond the moment
Right.
of having a wonderful time.
I wonder if you would. I do have a favorite story of one of the hundreds of stories in this book, but I wonder if you would share with us the story of your mother having met Bill Styron, her reaction to that, and then what she endeavored to do for people who haven't read the book yet. Would you mind sharing that little story, and maybe the stepmother's letter as well?
Oh, well, Bill was the first novelist to have a prix de Rome at the American Academy of Arts and Letters in Rome, which was this beautiful, beautiful building. And I had just arrived, and I got a letter from one of my Johns Hopkins professors saying, Bill Styron has just come to Rome, to the American Academy, and he doesn't know anybody there. If you get to the Academy, please look him up. So I looked him up. We had quite a fantasy getting together. I didn't know who I was. He called me up because I left him my number, and he said, come to the basement of the Excelsior Hotel and meet me for a drink. So I went down to the Excelsior, and the other person at the table was Truman Capote. And of course I'd read Truman Capote. I'd never read Bill Styron. I didn't know what the hell he'd written. But he had published his book, and it actually was on the bestseller list at that moment. And so as they were talking, and I met Truman, Truman was saying how much he loved Bill's book, and I stupidly said, me too. And of course, I hadn't read it. So at the end of the evening, which was like 5 in the morning, what Truman said, Bill, you ought to marry that girl. So he called me the next day. He didn't propose that soon, but he did call, and we made another date. And I thought, oh my God, I said I'd read that book and I haven't. So I went all over Rome, and I couldn't find the book anywhere, but even though it was on the bestseller list. And I went to the American library. There's one everywhere in Europe. And I said, do you by any chance have Lie Down in Darkness? And the woman said, she looked at her, whatever she looks at, and said, oh, yes, we have it. If you want to get a library card, we'll give it to you. Bring it back in 2 weeks. And I breathed a huge sigh of relief, and I went back to my little pad, which I was sharing with 2 American girls, and sat up in bed and turned to page 1 and started to read. And I thought to myself, he's cute, but he can't write. It was awful. And I thought, whatever am I going to say to him when we have a date tomorrow night? So I woke up in the morning and luckily opened it to the front page, not the first page, but to the introductory. And it said, Lie Down in Darkness by somebody else. And I learned that you can't copyright a title to a book, and that, thank God it wasn't Bill Styron's book. And I said, well, I hope he'll think this is funny and not awful when I meet him tonight. So he thought it was funny.
Oh, thank God.
He gave me his book, and of course, I spent the next 3 days reading it. It was wonderful. And we started our romance, I guess you would say. But you asked me about my mother.
I do want. I do.
I guess everybody has to talk about his or her mother at some point.
It-
Anyway,
Sooner or later. Yeah.
she, I was caught in Bill's room at the academy, and the academy's director was very cross at Bill. So he got us a little pad right next door to the academy, sort of down in the basement, and we began having a lovely time. He performed all his duties during the day, and I had a nice little pad, and I would go up to the park and write my poetry during the day. But my mother came. She was a friend of the current ambassador, and she went to the embassy and called me up and saw that I was living with a guy,
Oh God.
which was not done in those days. You know how old I am, so you can imagine how long ago that was. And she totally disapproved. But she wanted to meet Bill. I won't go into that. And she met him, and I thought everything had gone okay. And she called me weeks later and said, "Oh, I'm in Cherbourg, dear. I'm taking the boat back to New York. I had such a wonderful time on my trip in Europe, especially in Rome with you." And I said, "Mom, I've got the best news. I'm going to marry Bill Styron." Click. She hung up. And then I didn't find out till we had gone to Paris for Christmas to visit the Paris Review crew, because the first issue was about to come out and Bill had written an introduction to it. And so while we're getting settled, and we got a little room next to where Peter Matheson had his apartment, and we're sitting on the bed, and Bill is opening a letter from his father, who was wonderful and who he was very close to. His mother had died when he was 13, and he had married the head nurse because he was so depressed about his wife dying that he married her. So my husband, not yet, my beau, Bill, is reading this letter from his father. He's reading it aloud to me, and it's, "Hey, son, what kind of trouble are you in? You can tell me. You know that I'm with you no matter what. But what is it? A gumshoe has come from Washington on the ferry," because detectives were called gumshoes in those days. And he's talking to everybody in the neighborhood and asking all kinds of questions about you. And whatever trouble you're in, don't worry, I'm with you. And I said, "Oh my God," I interrupted him. "I know what's happened. My mother is having you and your family investigated." And so
It really is.
I said, "I can't let you marry into a family like this." I knew about it because she'd had my older brother investigated once when he was in the Navy, for God's sake, having a little thing. So he said, "You're absolutely right. Let's just have a good time in Paris over Christmas and New Year's," which we did, "and then we'll drive back to Rome and split up," which we did. But
For several months,
for
right?
several months, but then Easter came. I went back to Rome, started again. By the beginning of May, we were married. So
And neither of you invited your...
we couldn't invite our
Parents, yeah,
parents because of the way my mother felt. And Bill's father had married the head nurse, who had written to me and said, "Don't be ridiculous. Don't marry Billy Styron. Billy will never amount to anything." So
But
I tore that up, and we did not invite our parents. But my big brother came.
And your mother eventually came around, right?
Oh, she loved Bill.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Once they got to know each other,
Right.
it was swell, and she collected all his books. And They
And
had
you
a
never
good time
mentioned it to
together,
her.
and we loved his father, who also liked my mother. So that worked out
Well,
nicely.
that worked out well, very well. Um, so, uh, The Feminine Mystique came out in 1963 after when you were deep into having children and living in Roxbury, raising your young children. Um, uh, Not all of whom had been born yet, but still you had two or three. And uh, we were talking.
All but Alexandra,
Al.
who talked this morning, had been born. Okay, go ahead.
And a lot of women, had what Jane O'Reilly called, that aha moment where they thought, "Oh my God, I've, I want life to be more than this. I've been snookered. I've been brainwashed by the culture." It didn't seem to me that you felt that way at all. That you
No,
really robustly loved being a mother and a wife for many years.
I did. I had a wonderful, wonderful life in rural Roxbury, Connecticut, the smallest town in Connecticut. And I was outside with my three little children a lot of the time, and it was like my real childhood.
Getting to experience that
And
again.
having a wonderful time with them. And then after I put them to bed, I was with my wonderful husband, and different friends came to visit all the time. James Baldwin came to live with us. Phil Roth came in next door. And so we had a lot of literary company as well as lots of musicians and actors, and it was a great little town.
But at some point, did you feel like you needed a bigger stage, as it were? I mean, you started traveling for Amnesty and other organizations eventually. You went to so many countries, I stopped listing them in my notes because it just goes on, and many countries multiple times, doing this very important work. And I wondered if part of you, what made you take on a bigger world than Roxbury? Not that you'd never left Roxbury before that, but clearly there was a big change in your life. Was it just time for that in your life, or?
No, I think because we had a neighbor who, she was Russian, and she'd married an American neighbor, and she was from a literary family, and she brought a great many poems by important Russian writers out of Russia, because her family had gone to France, and then she'd married and come here and gone back. And I couldn't, she asked me if I would please do a book with her. And I said, well, I don't know any Russian. And she said, well, I can speak English, but I can't write it. So I went to Yale for a year, your and Susanna's territory, and studied Russian enough to help translate and put two books together of Russian poems. And then Bill had written The Confessions of Nat Turner.
Right.
And the Russians thought he was a good revolutionary, which he was not. But we were both invited to this Afro-Asian Writers Conference. We were the only Westerners there. And because we were off in Tashkent, where nobody could hear us complain about Russia invading Czechoslovakia. When we were in Moscow, we all complained. We were sent to Tashkent in Middle Asia, and not only had an extraordinary time, but I got to know all these dissident writers from Africa and Europe and Asia who couldn't be published in their own country. And that's why the Russians had invited us there to get all together.
Right.
And most of them spoke English. They didn't write English, but they spoke it. And I got quite attached to all of their stories of being mistreated dissidents in their countries. And when we left, they piled all their manuscripts into my suitcase and said, please take them to the U.S. and get them translated. So I took them to Yale, gave it to them, went to Washington, thinking I could tell the State Department about all the trouble people were in and what were we going to do about it. And they patted me on the head and they sent me home. And I didn't know what to do with all this. But Barbara Sproul, who was Philip Roth's girlfriend at the time, had just joined the first group of Amnesty International USA in New York. And she took me in, and I sat there with the 6 first members. I wasn't a founding member. I was a member of the first. Sorry about this. I was a member of the first little group of 6 who founded, founded Amnesty International USA. And
was that called the Riverside Group, wasn't it?
The Riverside Group.
Riverside
Good
Drive?
for you. Yeah.
Oh, I just happened.
Yeah, it was on Riverside, and there was no table in the room we met at, so we all sat around. The Englishman who had started it, his mother had this little apartment on Riverside Drive, and she had a big bed draped in silks and so forth, and that was our table. We sat around and did that. So that's how I got into it. And then they called me from London and asked me if I would please go to Chile when Pinochet had his coup, because they needed to find out where all the political prisoners were who had been part of Allende's entourage, I should say, or supporters of him. And Pinochet had made sure they were all sent all over Latin America in different prisons. And my job was to find out where they were from their wives or families, so Amnesty could try to help get them out. So that was my first mission. And then, of course, I was hooked because they sent me to lots of others. My daughter Susanna, who's here, came with me to Chile and saved the day because she spoke Spanish very well as a teenager, and I didn't. But that was the beginning of lots of adventures.
And that opens the book, too. It's a wonderful chapter that opens your book.
Yeah,
that's a
Chile.
Pretty fantastic chapter. Rose, do you think, I asked you earlier today if either where you got your sense of political activism, whether either of your parents had that, and you said no, just not at all.
No.
And then I wondered how much the fact that you attended a friend's school, how much Quakerism may have had to do with that, a sense of
a sense of
social
duty,
engagement,
of social duty.
Yes.
Yes, of trying to make the world better, not militarily, but personally. Yes, I think the Quakers were the biggest influence in my life. I was there from kindergarten through 12th grade.
It's and you went. They had Quaker meeting once a week, once a day, at your school. Do you remember?
Once a week.
Once a week.
You know, and I got up and talked from time to time because I was a talker. But
I wanted to ask you, in terms of your husband, you wrote about his a kind of fragility that he had, that you had noticed a little when over the years, a certain fragility is your word for it, was your word for it. And I wondered if you had any sense that this would be connected to any kind of um, serious later depression, or whether one doesn't know these things years, 30 years in advance.
I don't remember saying that, but I was never depressed, but my husband certainly was. And he was very, very emotionally fragile. And we had,
Did you know that? I mean, was he emotionally fragile before you? Again, I think you suggest that there were sort of intimations of it. Sometimes he would be super concerned about your safety or your children's safety, a kind of anxiety um, uh,
he
about
did.
your physical safety that
He was
obsess him.
always worried that something was going to happen to me or happen to the children. And if he got bad reviews, as he did after the Confessions of Nat Turner,
Oh, devastating! Yeah.
when there were 10 black writers respond, even though Skip Gates and the good historians all protected him.
And Baldwin.
Yeah, and oh yeah, and James Baldwin and all of them. Nevertheless, because there was this book out, and he worried so that he would not let the children go outside without me. And if I was an hour late getting home, he was at the door frantic. But his mother had died when he was 13, but she had been sick since he was a little boy, and so I think he had to come home from school and take care of her a lot. And so I think he always knew she was going to die, and that set him up for being scared that he was going to lose me or the kids at any moment.
At any moment, yeah. I wanted to read some beautiful, in the book, you quote Peter Matheson speaking at Bill's memorial in New York. We was looking at this with you earlier today, and Matheson is recounting the first time he met Bill which was in the spring of 1952. And I have a question that comes at the end of this passage that Matheson spoke, but I just wanted to read it to you, which I read to you earlier today. On that homesick first evening years ago, Bill confessed they had met in Paris. Bill confessed that he had very little tolerance for change. No more resistance to change than a snowflake, is how he put it. I think Bill never lost that snowflake aspect of his being, that fragile, unspoiled quality that made all of us indulge him no matter what. And as we know, that what could be quite something. But if you'll forgive me, we all spoiled him. Everybody but his kids, perhaps, in those years when they were growing up at home. We wanted to spoil him. Why? Was it simply because we recognized instinctively that Styron was a great artist who needed to air out all that pent-up creativity and therefore required special handling out of our respect for his rare gift? I suppose so. And later on, after we'd spoiled him, it was easier and easier to take no notice, to let it go. But that metaphoric snowflake, that delicate, undefended sensibility explains much, I think, about why we always sheltered our old friend and why we loved him. And then you say, as the writer, you just pose the question, should I have, how that resonated for me, you say. Should I have indulged him as I did? And then you just leave it unanswered, which I love. And I don't know, maybe it's less a question than a comment, that the question of how we treat the artist who happens to be in our family, or do we excuse everything? Do we, do you have an answer for that question now, or should we just let it lie there?
I don't think I have an answer. I spent a lot of time trying to protect my children, who I adored, and who he adored, but he couldn't stand noise, he couldn't stand anything he didn't know about that was going to happen. Many, many wonderful events or trips we had planned were canceled at the last minute because he couldn't figure out how everything would go. And of course, I got mad. I mean, I'm not a person who
No, you're
doesn't
not a
get mad.
pushover.
But
So,
yes, I indulged him. I was brought up always to let the man lead, and especially one's husband. And we actually had a wonderful marriage with ups and downs and so
and a
forth.
long, long, long one. Well, I thought before we turn it over, if we have just a moment to let Rose read the poem that opens the book, um, and that is from by Vineyard Light, and it's just an appropriate poem for today, and
We'll see if
we'll
I
see.
can
See
still
if
read
Rose
it.
can read it, and if she can't, well, I'll
The,
step in.
the title of the book, Beyond This Harbor, is the last phrase of the poem, which is, I think, why you asked me to read it.
Yes, it is.
Good night, great summer sky, world of my childhood, and the star-struck sea. White chaise from that ancestral southern porch, my raft. White goose down quilt, my ballast. Under Orion on the green waved lawn, I float high. New moon, old craft, tied strong as ever to the sheer horizon. Over the seawall on the dock, Andromeda, their strict and jeweled guard, as tall Orion, seas and lawns ago, chose to be mine. Our children sleep, Alexandra, Tom, under their folded goose-wing sails, true friends in dream, the folly wrangle of their sibling day outshone by starlight. Calm island evening, never-ending sea, our lovers' rages too are quiet, drowned. Miracle of midsummer, the trust of dark sails us beyond this harbor.
Thank you, thank you, thank you.
Thank you.
That's such a beautiful poem. Such a and perfect time and place for it.
Thank you.
How do we do our Q&As?
Okay. Yes, Rosewood. Hi. Your book
Oh,
has
there you are.
your book has so many wonderful stories. Two questions. One, would you just tell the story about the fourth grade teacher who accused you of plagiarism and its connection with your becoming a poet? But then also would you talk, because your husband was not particularly supportive of your poetry. Could you talk a little bit about how you dealt with that? Or at least it seems that you're becoming a poet. He apparently didn't read your poetry. Was that tough to deal with?
Well, if I understand you, you want me to mention how I started
Yes.
publishing poetry.
Well, the fourth grade teacher.
I was in fourth grade, and Miss Rowe, our teacher, who thought I was very naughty anywhere, she would put me in the closet from time to time if I was too naughty. Hauled me up in front of the class one day and accused me of plagiarism. Well, what 9-year-old knows what plagiarism is? And I said, what? And she said, well, I saw the poem you copied from somebody else and put your name on that's in the Friends High School magazine. And that's plagiarism. And I said, but I wrote that poem. And she didn't believe me. So when I went home, I thought, wow, if somebody thinks someone older wrote a poem of mine, maybe I can be a poet. And I really think that's when I decided that I was going to be a poet.
Very characteristic of you to take that lesson out of that story, rather than never write another poem again, which would probably be most.
But as far as your second question about Bill, who did not really support me, I mean, I had a contract and book, blah, 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 but Bill was so in need of his own time, thoughts, brain, ego, whatever it is, that he wasn't a bit interested in my poetry. And because I had had my second daughter, Polly, by that time, she's here too, I think, I began just writing poems and putting them in the drawer and not worrying about publishing and not caring about it, really, because I had such a good full life. But one day I came home after taking the kids to school, and a writer you may have heard of, Jerzy Kosinski, was sitting at my desk in rural Connecticut because he was at Yale and just wandering around. And when I came in, he had the drawers of my desk open. And I said, "What are you doing?" And he said, "Whose poems are these?" And I said, "They're mine." And he said, "Well, I'm going to take them to Yale to my girlfriend, Kiki von Fraunhofen, and have her type them. And I'm going to take them to my publisher." And so by that time, I had a book of poetry for young people already published by Viking and hadn't bothered with the adult poems. And I said, "Well, thanks, get her to type them. I'm not going to type them. But give them back to me and I'll see if Viking wants to publish them, and if not, I'll give them back to you." Well, Viking published them, and I had 3 more volumes. So that was the beginning of my getting back to publishing poetry. But then when I got to Amnesty a number of years later, I stopped writing poetry for 20 years because it comes from a different part of the brain than activism does.
Yes.
Thank you. When you were in Chile and in Russia as an American at times when Chile and Russia were very in opposition to America, how did you manage to escape their surveillance and bring all this information and these written poems out of the country?
Well, in Chile, because I had my 17-year-old daughter, Susanna, with me, who spoke good Spanish, I pursued the wives of the political prisoners who had all been part of Allende's regime, if you will. But of course, he had been killed by that time by Pinochet. And I pursued the wives of those men who were all in prisons around Chile and Argentina, actually, at that time. And they gave me all the information that I needed. Of course, I made them after they told me that I'd make them tell Susanna to make sure I got them right. And so I had wonderful new women friends in Santiago, all of whom helped me. And the daughter of one of them, and she became an ambassador herself later, was president of Chile twice, Michel Letelier. And so it was the women of Chile who really helped me get all the information and bring it back to the UN so Allende's widow, Hortensia, could go speak at the UN a couple of weeks later with all this information, and the UN and Amnesty went to work. Is that sort of what you wanted to know?
No, but that's okay.
Oh, well, tell me what I missed.
Well, I was just wondering how you were able to go to these women who were Pinochet, the wives of Pinochet's enemies, and as an American, and not attract the notice.
I did. I
Oh.
did. We had to do a lot of hiding and a lot of escaping, and we were lucky. And if you ever saw the movie Missing, that's where we were in that hotel with the only other Americans who were there, who was Charles Horman's family. And so we got involved that way also.
That answers.
But we were just lucky.
I'm curious what brought you to the vineyard, and that you spent so many years here. Obviously, we all know why, but what brought you here?
Where are you? I can't tell.
Right
Oh,
here.
hi.
Hi.
Sorry. Would you repeat that?
Yes, I just wondered what brought you to Martha's Vineyard, the decision to come. And as I say, we all know why you stayed once you got here, but I'm just curious what brought you here.
Well, interestingly enough, my husband's editor, Hiram Hayden, had a house here. And Bill and I and our 2-year-old daughter, Susanna, were in Nantucket. And Hiram called and said, if you're in Nantucket, you have to come to Martha's Vineyard, take the ferry, and I'll meet you at the dock. And that was the only summer that there was a ferry coming occasionally from Nantucket to the vineyard, which we didn't know, but we got on it. We arrived, and there was nobody at the Vineyard Haven dock at all. Hiram had forgotten. But we saw running across in front of us pretty soon a very odd-looking figure who turned out to be Lillian Hellman. And we had met Lillian once in Rome in an elevator. We didn't know each other really, but we had met once, and we recognized her, and she was running across the dock, chasing the biggest black poodle you've ever seen, and she was screaming at it, "Gregory Zilborg, come back here." Gregory Zilborg. She named him for her shrink, who I guess she couldn't control either. Anyway, she turned, we recognized each other, and she said, when we told her that Hiram had forgotten, she said, well, my house is right over there. Come, and we'll call Hiram, and you wait here with me. And so we walked over to her house and up on the porch, and she called Hiram. And in the hour before he got down here from Chilmark, she berated us for going to that terrible island of Nantucket. Don't ever go there again, she said. I'm going to get you a house here next year. So she got us a house for a couple of weeks, and we were so in love with the vineyard that we lived all over, we rented all over the place before we finally bought a house in Vineyard Haven, up next to the Vineyard Haven Yacht Club. That's another story. But between Lillian's house near the harbor and our house, we were then told we had bought on Murderers Row because of all the angry writers who lived there. And there were a lot of them.
Jenny, I think we have time for a quick question before Rose is scheduled to be signing books in the signing tent.
Wonderful.
Hello, Rose. I'm over here. to your right.
Oh, right
Here
over
I
here.
am.
Hi.
Here I am. Hi. My name's Hortense, like Hortensia. And I had the pleasure of being regaled by your stories at the Woods Hole Film Festival when I watched the documentary of your life.
Oh,
And I can't wait to dive into the book, after watching that. And so, that film inspired a lot of discussion amongst some of our interns at the Woods Hole Film Festival, some of the younger women. So I'd be remiss if I didn't ask you if you could impart some words of wisdom, what you would tell your younger Rose self about life. What wisdom would you tell the young version of you?
wow.
Really good question. For the
It's a
last
great question. I don't know what I would tell them except to live in the moment, look to the future, know that whatever you dare to do will pay off some way, in a good way, and that the important thing when you get to be as old as I am is to have friends like I have on the vineyard. My family, of course, but friendship and keeping in touch with the world through your friends when you live alone or a long time on the vineyard is really important for knowing what's going on in the world, for planning your own writing or your own life, and just be with it in the moment is all I can say.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you.